We're back.
Do you want to come and touch my shaft?
I'd love to.
It's oily, well lubed.
Right, enough of that.
It's well lubed and it is broken.
So tell me more.
So this is a 5.2 crankshaft, or wobble shaft, we could call it. Variable height shaft. No, 5.2 crank, V10, that's had a bad day. So engine came in completely locked up, and it's done some bearings and it's done quite a bit of damage. So that's the upper bit. That's the upper main bearing, and you can see the state of it. It's completely worn away the coating and started to pull the bearing material out underneath, and you can see the state of the crank. I mean, that's a mess, and you can even see the heat right off either side the journal, and there's a big ridge. But this is sort of the other interesting bit. So the geometry of the engine means that oil comes from the upper crankcase through the upper bearing to feed the crank, and then obviously that's where your film wedge comes from, and then that lubricates the main. But also what happens is the pressure is fed down this hole, and there's one on each side, and they're both cross drilled into the rod bearings, into the big ends. So as you can see there, look, we've obviously had bearing pickup here, which is crossed over to the big end bearings.
Yep.
And that's because all that bearing material that you can see is jacked up and filled the gallery, because you can even see which way the bearing was rotated. So it's tried to drag all the junk out and it's jacked it into this groove. But what it's also done is it's pumped it down the cross drill holes, the cross holes, right? Which has then blocked oil flow to the big ends and done the damage to the big ends, right? So this is a lubrication problem. Now this just so happens, if you look at the others, so that's number 6 main, 5, 4, 3, 2 and 1 are mint, right? And then you can obviously see the big ends then for 1 and 6, 2 and 7, 3 and 8, 4 and 9 are fine, 5 and 10 look like this.
Whoops.
Yeah, right? So now people are going to go, what caused it? Well, there's a couple of theories. One, it's the furthest bearing away from the oil pump, so there's that to consider. Is that a factor? The oil pressure was reduced, didn't drop completely, and it was enough to serve all these bearings, but to starve this one, because the cam journals are mint, the heads are perfect, right? There's no debris in the sump, so sometimes what we see on 5.2s is people take rear timing covers off, scrape the gasket sealant off, are a little bit messy, and that waste sealant falls inside the rear timing cover, and then it blocks the scavenge pump ports on the oil pump. And then when that happens, you get that sort of thing. So what happens there is then the oil can't be scavenged at the crankcase, so it can't fill the tank, and then there's not enough oil in the tank then to satisfy what the pump's doing. So we've seen that quite a few times, where the tank's empty but the crankcase is full to the brim, and the scavenge ports in the pump block solid with liquid sealant. People go crazy when they're sealing these engines up. So we've seen that a couple of times. This isn't like that. This is immaculate. The oil's perfect. The oil was 3 months old, so it had recently been serviced. The guy who owns it looks after it. The car's in immaculate condition. He warms it up. So there's no reason. This is a complete freak of nature as to why this has happened. We can't find any sort of rhyme or reason. Not conclusive anyway. There's no oil pressure data logging on the car, so we can't obviously see whether that's an issue. So now we need a block. We'll walk over and I'll show you the block in a minute and why we need a new block. We need a crank. Because you're having a new block, you need a new set of pistons, because you can't put old pistons in a new block. The rods only come in sets of 10. So now all of a sudden you need a crank, set of rods, set of pistons and a block. Then obviously bearings, timing chains, that sort of thing going with it. Now, you spend all that money doing that, do you take the risk with the old oil pump? Do you take the risk?
No.
And people sat at home, regardless of you know whether you can afford this. Nobody can afford these repairs. Do you know what I mean? Nobody wants to sit there and go, well, I can afford. This is a complete freak of nature. This is bad luck. This is lottery the opposite way. You know. But can you trust the oil pump? No. You're going to put one in. What about if I tell you your oil pump's $4,000? So there comes that point where we know what we must change because we can see it. But where do you know what I mean?
Where do you draw the line? Yeah.
Engine's 30, because it's a Gen 1 engine, engine's $38,000 plus of that. 38? 36. It's in the 30s.
Yeah.
Either way, it don't matter. Do you know what I mean?
It's a lot of money.
It's 2/3 the value of the car.
Yeah.
So buying a new engine's out. They don't do a built bottom end. So you're into buying a block, building a bottom end. So yeah, this is a bit of a mess. We don't see many failures like this. Like you've all seen the GT3 engine that we stripped down, and you've seen a video for that, and how good that looked when it came apart, considering that spends its life being battered.
Yeah.
And this guy babies his car, looks after it, lives in a garage under a cover on a CTAC, warms it up, drives it not very often, and this has happened. And this is the bad side of motoring, right? This is the of car ownership. So if we spin you around, and we look at a set of rods. So again, they're laid out in cylinder order, so you're now stood behind a car. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So you can see, look, all right, a little bit bare and white, but again, you know, it's not a 0 miles car. There's nothing there that would freak me out, you know. There's nothing horrific, there's no big particle scores, there's no big signs of burning, or you just get normal wear, and then you get to the two that have been starved, and you can see just look at the difference in the rods. You know, you can see the heat build up in a rod. So now, regardless of the size of everything, whether they size up right, they're junk. You can't use something that's had that much heat through it. So we obviously know the crank's scrap. We know this is scrap. You know, again, pistons don't look bad, but you can't put old worn pistons in a new block. You know, you're not going to trust these. And then when the bearings come out, look, can you see where, like, the bearings almost started to melt into the back of the rod, and like that feels really, really crusty. Feels like it's corroded, and it's just the damage of the heat. And this wasn't driven. He just pulled up at a set of lights, and he said the car just stalled and then wouldn't restart. So it's not like he was doing 6,000 RPM and it locked up, and you can see that because everything else looks so good. So yeah, everything's a mess. And then if you come over, you grab me a rag. And if you come over to the block, so again, nothing horrific, you know, nothing scary. And then you get here, look, and you can see all the old bearing material sat in the gallery. But then I don't know whether you can just see that right on the edge, David. Can you see that sort of mottled edge?
Yeah.
That's the block has melted. So there's a massive step there, and that's a sharp ridge. So the bearing, it didn't spin the mains, it spun the big ends, it didn't spin the mains, but the heat has deformed the journal, and the bearing sunk into the journal. So now this is scrap. It's just junk. There's nothing you can do with that. Now people might turn around and say, "Oh, you can line hone it." There's a couple of things you've got to take into consideration there. In theory, yes. In reality, no, and for a couple of reasons. One, it's an aluminium block, so the uppers are aluminium journals. The lower girdle is aluminium with steel caps, right? So you've got aluminium block, steel caps. So to line hone it, what you would normally do is you would skim the bottom of this, you'd skim that, so you close the top and bottom of the hole together, then you'd line hone it. That's what you'd normally do. The problem when you've got aluminium bottom and steel top is it pushes off the steel into the aluminium. If you've ever tried to drill a steel bolt out of an aluminium casing, you'll know what I mean. If you slip off a steel bolt into the aluminium, your drill just keeps going through the casing and you're not touching the bolt. Same theory. You're going to push against a steel cap into an aluminium housing, so you're not going to line hone it square. Then what you're also doing is you're pushing the crank further into the block. So now you're changing basically your deck height, or you're changing the distance between the top of the deck and the crank. There is a word for it, and I can't think of what the word is. There'll be people that will comment on it. But you're putting the crank further into the block. So essentially, if you don't change your piston height, or your compression height, or your rods, you push the piston further out of the block. Does that make sense? Yeah. And we're talking tiny amounts here, but tiny amounts matter. When you're doing bearing clearances to microns, this all matters. So yes, in theory, you could do it, but the knock-on effect to that is just massive, because the big American V8s is where you'd normally see it, where you'd sort of re-engineer the whole bottom end, but then you're already into custom pistons and stuff anyway. No one messes around with that kind of stuff, and you start playing around with compression on a naturally aspirated, and it kills them. These are really high compression engines. They're 12.5 to 1. So we drop a bit of compression out of them, or we start changing around things like that, and you just lose power and you can't get it back. It's not like on a boosted engine or an old Cosy where you drop the compression right out, but you put a boost through the roof to make it back. It's not like that on naturally aspirated. So yeah, it's just a real shame the damage it's done, and it's only isolated to that area. And the risk involved in trying to repair that, for me, is too much. Because if it goes wrong, it's a 40 grand or 35 grand engine. So, there comes a point where you go, right, okay, well, I think we just need a block. Because that is a massive step. So you've got to take a considerable amount of material out of that. So it's, bit of a shame. But I don't know whether you can see down through the boards. They look mint. The thing looks mint. It's a real head scratcher on what's caused it, really.
Yeah.
Oil's good quality. It's looked after. For me, it hasn't lost oil pressure, but maybe it's got reduced oil pressure, and that's obviously then related to the pump. So for us, it would be, let's build the engine and change pump, but you just add in numbers and numbers and numbers, and it's, you want to make people cry, because it's the guy's gutted. The guy is gutted who owns this. And like you said, it's not like he abuses it.
Yeah.
He really does care for it. So yeah, not very nice. And I hate giving the news. I hate giving the news, because at first we thought the way he described it sounded like starter motor had locked up. He's like, "Oh, Rick, start." I pulled up, set lights, and it stalled, and then the starter's clicking. I'm like, "Oh, right, we might just be, mate. It's fine." And then we obviously got it here, and because we've had starters fail, because they hang out the bottom of the engine, and they hang out the bottom of the gearbox, and they hang out the bottom of the under tray. So we get it a lot on older Gallardos where the starter motors are just knackered. So we're like, oh, maybe, and we got it back. We took start motor off it, and couldn't turn it over. Made sure it wasn't trapped in gear or anything silly like that, and we were like, this is compressor. We were hanging on it with a bar and we couldn't budge it, and it's, even we had rods and pistons out, and just the bottom girdle with a crank in, we couldn't turn it. So it's, a real shame, this one, a real shame. It doesn't happen often. The guy asked me, a lot of people ask now they've seen it, it doesn't happen often. The ones behind me are not in for failures. That one's in, a guy's bought a new crank and bits and pieces, so that's a refresh. We know about the GT3 engine, the GT engine's a refresh. So, you know, we don't see catastrophic failures like this at these engines. And look at what everyone's doing. I mean, we're doing 1100 horsepower on a stock motor, you know, and the American boys have gone even harder, and they're not changing anything. So yeah, a bit of a freak, this one, a bit of a weird one, a bit of pill to swallow. But we'll get it sorted. Customer's got to make a decision on which route he wants to go. But yeah, when we know what's what, we'll let you all know.
Lovely job.
All right.
Thank you, buddy.
See you all later.